Hello, and welcome to a video tutorial on how to use the new RotoWire NBA DFS lineup optimizer. To get to the optimizer from the RotoWire homepage, scroll up to Daily Fantasy Sports and select the DraftKings NBA optimizer. This will take you to the homepage of the optimizer. If you'd like to choose a different site than DraftKings, you can see that we support 6 different DFS sites, including FanDuel, Yahoo, FanBall, SuperDraft, and Owner's Box. Before we get into the lineups or customizations page, let's take a look at the slate. Today we're going to use the October 25th slate with a 12-game main slate. If you'd like to go to a different slate, you can simply click on Change Slate and choose between one of the other slates. You can also sort by just the classic slates and the showdown slates. You can also sort by a variety of things. Here we have the games sorted by game time, but you can also sort by most implied points for each team on the slate, from highest all the way down to the lowest. You can also sort by the over-unders, starting with the Atlanta-Charlotte game, which has the highest over-under on the slate, all the way down to the lowest over-under on the slate. You can also sort by win probability percentage, with the Heat having the highest chance of winning. And then you can sort by the money line for each game, as well as the spread for each game. Next, let's take a look at the player pool. Here we have all of the players in the slate sorted by the most fantasy points, starting with Luka Doncic at the top. Let's take a look at what each column represents. We have the lock column here, and if you lock a player, that's going to guarantee that that player shows up in every one of your lineups. You can exclude a player by clicking the red X, which will guarantee that that player never shows up in one of your generated lineups. You can hit the like button, and that's going to boost each player's fantasy projection that you like by 10%. Each player's eligible position for that DFS site, the team that player plays on, their opponent for the game. And then lineup here shows that if we expect them to be in the starting lineup, they will show yes. And then if we don't expect them in the starting lineup, it will say BN for bench. And that will show up as confirmed once starting lineups are confirmed. Here we have the projected minutes for each player. We have each player's salary on that specific DFS site, their projected fantasy points for today's slate, their projected value per $1,000 in salary. And then here we have minimum and maximum exposures. You can adjust this. So for example, if you want Luka Doncic in at least 10% of your lineups, you can change that to 10. Or if you don't want him in more than 40% of your lineups, for example, you can under 40 to cap him at 40%. Another feature you'll see here is a player's status for today's game. You can see the GTD for Luka Doncic, meaning game time decision. You can click on that player and read a note that says he's still officially questionable for tonight's game. This also shows the game and each team's implied points for the game, as well as the over-under. And then you can also see we have stars next to some players. That indicates that a player is a top play. So we note here that Jaren Jackson is a RotoWire top play, and you can read a description on why we like that player for that day's slate. Another thing you can do here is choose the custom view to add some other things into the optimizer. For example, you can add in odds for the game to see that team's implied score, their percentage chance of winning the game, the money line, the over-under for each game, as well as the spread for each game. You can also click the edit button to add in some other statistics that you may like. You can get rid of these columns if you want to, not have as much stuff show up in the player pool. You can add some things here, such as like the rostership projections we have. There's some advanced stats here. So if you wanted to see a player's, usage rate, you could click that, hit done, and now usage you will see in the player pool. This is currently showing as 0 just because it's day 2 of the NBA season. None of these players have played any games yet, but once they've played games, that usage rate would show up here. Okay. So now that we've taken a look at the player pool, let's take a look at the different customizations we can make before building our lineups. So we do have some default customizations built in here. We have minimum projected fantasy points. So if a player isn't projected for any fantasy points, they're not going to show up in our optimizer. You can edit this. If you wanted to set it to say like minimum 10 fantasy points for NBA, you could, adjust that here and save that. So feel free to play around with that. I'm just going to set it back to the 0.01 that we had it as. Set it at 1 there. Projection variance factor. So a lot of people like to have a little bit of a randomness involved in the calculations. So for example, if a player is projected for 10 fantasy points, if you have this set at 5%, that's going to adjust their projection randomly between 9.5 to 10.5 points. If a player was projected for 10 and had a 5% variance factored in. We also have this preferred late starts in flex. That's going to make sure that, for DraftKings, whoever you have in your utility spots is automatically the latest game in the slate. That gives you a little bit more roster flexibility, in case you want to make some late lineup changes. Some other customizations here that you can build into the optimizer. We can create some groups. One of the things here, conditional groups. Say, for example, we'll take a look at like Luka Doncic. If a lot of people may not want, like, for example, like the 2 best players on an NBA team in their lineup. So, for example, like it's pretty unlikely on a large slate like this that Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving would both show up in a winning GPP lineup. So you could set a rule that when you have Doncic come back in one of your lineups, Kyrie doesn't as well. Some other things here, you could adjust by lineup status. If you don't want any bench players in here, you could add that in here. If you want to, exclude injured players, you don't want anybody that is questionable to play. You could add that in here in case you don't have the time to, adjust your lineup later. You don't want to risk anybody with a questionable status showing up in your lineup. You could add that in. Here you can adjust your exposures. So if, for example, you don't want anybody showing up in more than like 40% of your lineups, you could add that in here. That way everybody will show up at 40% or less. In case you're doing a lot of lineups, that can be really helpful. You can adjust projections by team. So for example, if you really like Atlanta tonight to outperform our expectations, you could adjust everybody up. You could put 10% in here. You'd also put the negative in here as well. So you can go up or down with that. And that's going to boost everybody on the Hawks up 10%. So it's another cool thing that you can do. Some other things here, minimum and maximum salaries. This can be useful in showdown slates, one game slates where maybe you want to try to be, unique so that your lineup's not duplicated by other entrants. You could, set that at, say 49, 48,000. And then whatever, when you create your lineups, you're not going to get a lineup back that uses all 50,000 of your salary, for example. And then you can also exclude positions from the flex spot. So, if, for example, you don't like to have centers used in your utility spot, you could select that there and add that customization in. So now that we've taken a look at all of those customizations, we can go ahead and build some lineups here. So we can just go back to the home page. One thing I want to show is just how quickly that we can generate lineups. So if you want to, max enter a GPP and have 150 lineups, you can click on that and you can see that, boom, you have 150 lineups just like that. So another thing you can do here once you've made your lineups is you can customize your lineups view. So if you want to add some things in your lineups to see, like if you don't care about the rostership, you can get rid of that. If you want to see if someone is a RotoWire top play, you could add that in here. And it'll show like, oh, Evan Mobley is one of our top plays. And then, finally, you can download this to a CSV. This can be especially useful if you're, doing a bunch of lineups. You can just download that. And then when you can go to DraftKings, you can just import those in. So one other thing here we have too is we have exposure reports. So once you create all of your lineups, you can see what exposure you have of each player. This is going to show you that overall you have 100% Jaren Jackson, for example. So if you don't like how that came back, you could simply just go down to the player pool here, you can search for Jaren Jackson and say, yeah, 100% was too high. I'm going to move that down to 50. You could rerun lineups then, and then Jaren Jackson should be moved down to no more than 50%, which we see, boom, now he's at 50. So that completes the RotoWire NBA video tutorial. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to support@rotowire.com. Thank you.